What's up, guys? It is Sam here, and I wanted to talk about, as the title suggests, Grant Cardone versus Gary Vaynerchuk. And we're going to compare them in 7 different rounds to get a better understanding of the trajectory and what is going on with their social in terms of what they are doing. Because if you're trying to grow your presence online, you, generally speaking, for myself, I like to try to do things that are working. So one of the ways that you can do that is by being right next to a person who is doing things that are working. Another way you can do that is by observing from afar what other people are doing and then looking at the data to see what's actually working, and then you can try to do or mimic or recreate, whatever you want to call it, rip off, like I don't give a shit, like do what's working, right? So we want to take a look at one of these. Before we get started, leave down below in the comments who you think is going to win. And before you do that, though, let me give you the battlefields that we're going to compare on here. We've got Google search, so we're going to start the macro. Google search volume for these characters. YouTube search for these characters. Then the hashtag usage over a 2-month period of time on Twitter and on Instagram. And we're going to take a look at that. Next, we move on to Instagram. Currently the very hot platform. And then we're going to move on to their YouTube channels individually, as well as their Twitter and their website. So we're not just going to look at their Twitter or their Instagram. We're going to look at the data behind that to look at, say, some of the growth in followers and the growth in followers over time, the number of likes, the amount of work that is going to be put in. If you see that there's a certain amount of media being uploaded, then relatively speaking, you can see the amount of work that is getting put into some of these things and some other little nuanced details. And the same thing with the website. We're going to look at some really interesting numbers on to see how these their websites compare to each other, both in terms of a global ranking of websites, but also how much time is spent on each website relative to each other. So now that you know the battlefields we're going to be playing on, let me know down below in the comments before we get into the video who you think is going to win. Comment Grant or Gary. Let me know down below in the comments. Or if you have a little bit more of a nuanced answer, let me know which categories you think one of these guys is going to win versus the other ones. Now, with that being said, let's get into it. If this is your first time here, what's up? I'm Sam. And if you're returning, it's good to freaking see you. Okay, so now let's take a look at the past 5 years for Grant, Gary. So I'm using 2 search terms here. Gary Vaynerchuk and Gary V. I'm not going to really factor the Gary V into it, but I just feel as though that's probably similar in terms of usage on certain platforms versus other ones. Maybe not as much on Google, but like from a hashtag standpoint it is. So we'll get more into that in just a minute. Now, over the previous 5 years in terms of the search terms, meaning who is searched for Grant Cardone or Gary Vaynerchuk, the vast majority, over the past 5 years, it looks like Grant has probably had 20% more in terms of search volume. Now, when we come into the more recent data, like over the last 12 months, that lead is extended to probably about a 35 to 40% increase over the next closest, which would be Gary Vaynerchuk, and then Gary V is just like a little bit lower than Gary Vaynerchuk. We come into the 90-day, now it's about double the height, meaning Grant Cardone has about double the amount of search volume on Google versus Gary Vaynerchuk. So it looks like Grant is just running away at this point in the game. Again, stepping into the 30-day, same thing, about double let's step it all the way into the 7-day, and then we'll jump to the 4-hour. Okay, over the past 7 days, it's looks like more than double so far. Now, coming into the last 4 hours, so the most recent data, and again, more than double, almost 3 times as much. So that one for the search volume, which we ran it through pretty quickly, that we're going to give a win to Grant. Both at the very macro over the past 5 years. Also, what you could not see because it's on my computer is that Grant's is kind of like up and to the right, where Gary's is kind of up and to the right, but over the last year or so, it's kind of stagnated in terms of search of volume. So now let's go on to the next battlefield, which is YouTube. So we're going to come over to YouTube over the past 5 years on YouTube. So YouTube tells a little bit different of a story than Google search. Because on YouTube, Gary has had more search volume for his name on YouTube than Grant Cardone has at the 5-year mark. Now, let's take a look at the 12-month, though, and see if any of that changes, because they were pretty close. And when you jump over to the 12-month, there is a clear lead of probably about 20% for Grant Cardone versus Gary. So it looks like, let's see if the things shift again as we come in. But if we use the web search as any indicator of how it might progress, now it looks like it's about 40%. So Grant has gained more of a lead. And I have a feeling that is what the data is going to tell us as we continue to move in to the most recent data. Now we're looking at the 30 days, and we look at the geographic breakdown of search volume on a statewide basis, meaning that Grant Cardone versus Gary Vaynerchuk, in terms of the search volume in that state between those two, who earns more than 50% of that, and Grant is more searched for in the past 30 days in probably about 27 to 30 states, something like that. So I'm guessing the same thing is going to look at the 4-hour. Yep, about 2.5 times as much. So pretty substantially more interest in Grant Cardone on YouTube search and Google search. This is an early lead for Grant Cardone. I'm curious. So I've looked at some of this data, but I have not gone through and actually taken a look at any of these. So we'll see if this gets more interesting as we move on to the next battle, which is hashtags. So what this is the Grant Cardone hashtag, and I use the Gary Vaynerchuk or the Gary V hashtag because that's actually the hashtag that I've seen. I've actually never seen a Grant or a Gary Vaynerchuk one, and I think that the psychology is that people probably going to use what's a little bit easier, and Gary V is easier for most people to spell than Vaynerchuk. So I used Gary V. It is also really closely related to Gary, so that's why I use that versus Grant Cardone. I think you could potentially argue that 10x could be a hashtag for Grant Cardone. However, I think that represents more of his business and that event than it does Grant Cardone, where Gary V represents Gary Vaynerchuk. So that is why I chose that. Now, we're going to take a look first at Grant Cardone. And over the past 2 months, it's got a gauge of over the past 2 months on a weekly basis. And then on the left-hand side of the chart here, we have the frequency of usage over the past 2 months. And we have, I'm guessing this is in thousandths, we have a spike up in the middle of the chart for Grant, and then a drop down. Over the past 7 days, it looks like it's starting to come up a little bit, but it's still like it's probably at like the 1,000th mark in terms of how many people are using it. So that's pretty small. Another one that could be argued to use would be Cardone Capital, which I think represents a little bit more of what who Grant Cardone is, but I still think it's more of a business. I just think it's something he's very hot on right now, where, again, Gary V is kind of like that persona of him. So that's why we use it. Now, if we come over to Gary's, he is clearly up and to the right over the last 8 weeks on Twitter and on Instagram. So also another interesting thing is that there is, starting out around, say, maybe 6,000 or 7,000 hashtags used across these platforms over the past 2 months in that week, to, it looks like it's projected that it's going to finish this week at like maybe 24,000 usages of these hashtag Gary Vaynerchuk, Gary V hashtag across Instagram and Twitter. So a substantial difference in the volume of usage for the hashtag Gary V versus Grant Cardone, which is kind of interesting. So based on the volume of usage on Instagram and on Twitter, and the growth over time, we're going to go with Gary because he had the growth over time from the past 2 months. So we get to see a little bit of a trend over the last 2 months of up and to the right, as well as tremendously, like, multiples more in terms of the interest of other people talking about them using that hashtag. So what we're going to do here, and for the relevance, is this category is going to Gary. And just like that, they are only one battle apart from tying. And the next battlefield that we're going to step onto is Instagram. Instagram is super hot right now, and we are going to take a look at it. Okay, so we're going to take a look at Grant Cardone. He's got 1.9, almost 2 million followers. His engagement rate is 1.37. The average likes on his page are 26,000 and change. Average comments is 77, almost 800. Now, Gary's, just a recap of the stats here. We've got 6.5 million followers, so more than 3 times larger in terms of the account size. The engagement rate is also higher, so that's interesting because you would expect that engagement would go down as the account size got larger. So to have a higher engagement rate, and it doesn't sound like 1.37 versus 1.49 is a tremendous amount of difference in the engagement rate, but when you have 6.5 million followers, that's a pretty substantial difference between those two. Now, same thing when you come to the likes. So he is about 3.5 times more likes, but again, that's about the account size. And then in terms of the comments, this is the interesting thing. In terms of comments, he has almost 2.5 to 3 times more comments on average than Grant Cardone. So that is kind of interesting. Now, jumping down to the volume of output and the total number of followers gained over the past month or so. Actually, 2 weeks it looks like. No, it says monthly averages. Okay. So what we've got here for Grant Cardone is a total number of media uploaded, so pictures, video, etc., IGTV, of 90 pieces. So that's pretty substantial over the past 30 days. That's about 3 per day on average. He gained approximately 165,000 new followers. If you come down and look at the graph for his too, over time, about the last 2 weeks here, he is just up and to the right. So that is good, gaining a lot of followers. So daily followers, it looks like. Yep. And basically, they're all just up and to the right in terms of Grant's metrics. Now, jumping over to Gary's, which is kind of interesting. If you remember Grant, he put out 90 pieces of content, where Gary put out, over the past 30 days, 150 pieces. So about 1.7 or 1.8 times more media output. So in my eyes, that looks like it's more work to put out that amount of volume. So that's I would say that's a good thing. Next is the total followers, 178,500 over the last 30 days versus 165. So on the one hand, Gary is growing faster on absolute amount, meaning he's at 180,000 followers gained over the last 30 days, where Grant is at 165,000. However, Grant's account is 3 times smaller, which indicates how much more quickly Grant is growing. However, I think when we go through and really take a look at this, I don't know, there has to be something said with the higher engagement rate at 3.5 times the account size, and the work that is going into putting out 150 pieces of content on a monthly basis. For this round, it's almost a tie, because I like the growth rate, but I want the media output to go up. For Grant, I feel like I'm going to weight that positively for Gary, because it's just a lot. That's just a shitload of content. You know what I mean? Almost 4 per day on average. So that's just incredible. 150 pieces of content. That's incredible. And the engagement rate. This battle for Instagram, I'm actually going to give to Gary. So right now, halfway through this, we have 2-on-2. It's tied halfway through this. Next, let's jump in and take a look at their YouTube channels here. We'll go through this one a little bit faster. We got total views over the last 30 days is 4.4 million versus 3.3 million for Gary. So Grant has 4.4 versus Gary's is 3.4. So 1 million less views over the last 30 days. That's pretty substantial. Now let's look at the total number of subscribers, 40,000. 39,000 for Grant and 43,000 for Gary. Let's see what account is bigger. They're closer in size. They're about half. So Gary has about twice as much as Grant. Twice as much. So he has twice as many subscribers, and yet he has a lot more. Gary has about twice as many subscribers, and yet Grant is getting more views over the last 30 days. And he's growing at about the same absolute amount, which means that Grant is growing his channel quite a bit faster than Gary is growing his, and there's a lot fucking more views. And then when we look at these over time, it looks like, and this is over the last several years, Grant's so this is back to 2016. Grant's is just kind of like up and to the right gradually, where if you look at Gary's, his is like up in the media and then kind of spikes down. It's virtually like flat, or if anything slightly down maybe, but virtually flat. So this is actually pretty easy. I'm going to call this one, because it's just up and to the right over the last several years, and there's more views on a smaller base. I think this is a pretty definitive win for Grant Cardone. So again, we have Grant pulling away here to win. But let's jump over to Twitter now. We have 2 more battles to go here. We're going to try to wrap this up quick. We have 400,000 followers versus 1.9 followers for Gary. The average number of retweets is 167 versus 33, or 700 likes versus 100 likes. So it looks like Gary's putting in a substantial amount more time. Substantially more time in terms of retweeting and liking people's things. Looks like Grant has 5,100 new followers over the past 30 days, whereas Gary has 22,000 new followers. So not only is Gary growing about 4 times more than Grant is, because it's 5,000 versus 22,000. That's pretty substantial. Even though Grant is still probably growing on a percentage basis slightly faster, but to have something for he's got 400,000 followers versus 2 million. That's 5 times larger. So to still be growing at that rate when you're 5 times larger, that's pretty substantial. I would definitely say that's pretty substantial. Now let's take a look at that last character here. We have followers. So the tweets for Grant have been going down and to the right finishing out with around 500 per month, it looks like, over the last several months. And now Gary's have been, on average, substantially higher, up to the point where it was like 1,600 tweets in a couple of months. I would say that probably around 50% greater in terms of the volume of tweets for Gary, but way more engaged. So this one, man, this is a close battle. For Gary, because he has a much bigger account, and yet he's still growing at nearly the same pace as Grant going through this. So. And that actually is going to have to wrap this up. I'm going to have to do part 2 for the final. I apologize. I did not plan this, but I only have about 22 minutes before my camera stops filming. So for this last comparison here, like, make sure you press that subscribe button and watch the video that comes out right after this one. If you like Grant or if you like Gary, share this video with somebody else so that they can take a look at this from a different perspective than everybody else. And lastly, press that thumbs up button so more people can find out about this video. It helps out the channel tremendously. Peace.